Most men find out their wife has been lying to them for one reason. I found out for 17. My name is Walter Combs. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years installing security systems for half the houses in Reading, Pennsylvania, and until 11 days ago, I would have told you my marriage was the one thing in my life I never had to double-check the locks on. We'll get to that. But first, if you're new here, do me a favor and hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means a lot to an old man who still can't figure out how to work the analytics page. Hit like too, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read every one. Now, let me tell you about my wife. Her name is Margaret Combs. Everybody calls her Peg. Married 39 years, together 42. She does the crossword in pen, which I always thought showed a certain arrogance I found charming. She waters her African violets on a schedule taped inside the pantry door. She takes her tea black, no sugar, and she has read the same battered copy of Rebecca at least once a year since Nixon was president. I knew this woman. I knew every habit she had down to the second. Or I thought I did. It started on a Wednesday in October, the kind of gray Pennsylvania afternoon where the leaves come down sideways. Peg was in Harrisburg visiting her sister Doreen, some kind of church retreat, 3 days back Saturday. I was home alone with the dog and a refrigerator full of leftovers, feeling sorry for myself in that specific way retired men do when the house goes quiet. Then the water heater started making a noise. Not the usual knock and hiss you get when the pressure valve's tired. This was a low, grinding sound, almost rhythmic, coming from somewhere behind the wall in the basement, not from the unit itself. I called a plumber. First one that answered, a young guy named Curtis Boyle, worked for a two-man outfit called Boyle Brothers Plumbing and Drain. Showed up within the hour, toolbox in one hand, flashlight in the other, polite the way kids still are out here. "Give me 20 minutes," he said, and headed down the basement stairs. I went back to the kitchen, fed the dog, half-watched a rerun of a ball game I'd already seen. Living the bachelor life, or what passes for it at 64. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Curtis, who I could hear moving around directly beneath my feet. "Mr. Combs, there's a door back here behind your old freezer chest. It's got a bar lock on it from this side. You know what's in there." I laughed out loud, actually laughed, and typed back, "Curtis, that's just where we keep the Christmas decorations. There's no door." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Sir, it's definitely a door, and the bar lock's fresh, like it was installed recently. There's also a smell coming through the gap at the bottom. Not gas, something else." I stopped, halfway through pouring my coffee. A smell. I want you to sit with that word for a second the way I had to. Not gas, not mildew, not anything a plumber deals with every day and knows the name of. Something else, and a grown man who spends his life crawling through other people's basements didn't have a better word for it than that. I was down those stairs before I'd even set the mug down. Curtis was standing in front of our old chest freezer, the one Peg had insisted we keep for garden vegetables, even after the compressor died 8 years back, and he'd pulled it a foot away from the wall. Behind it was a door I had never once seen in 33 years of owning that house. 33 years. It was narrow, painted the same flat basement gray as everything else down there, and if that freezer had been flush against it, the way it had sat my entire adult life, you would never have known it existed. A steel bar lock, the kind you'd put on a shed, bolted across the frame from the outside. And that smell, faint, sweetish, wrong. "You want me to call somebody?" Curtis asked, and I could hear in his voice that he already knew the answer. "Call the police," I told him. 3 officers arrived in under 10 minutes, this being the kind of town where that still happens. I stood in my own basement feeling like a trespasser in my own life, while a young patrolman worked the bar lock loose with a crowbar from his trunk. I texted Peg twice. "Call me when you get a second. Something's happening at the house." No answer. Probably in the middle of a sermon, I told myself. I needed to tell myself something. The door swung open on hinges that hadn't been oiled recently, or maybe had. I couldn't tell anymore what I actually knew. The room behind it was maybe 8 feet by 10, poured concrete floor, no windows, obviously walled off from the rest of the unfinished basement at some point in the past. It was empty except for a folding cot with no sheets, a portable space heater, unplugged, and on the floor beside it, a small ceramic dish with the dried remains of something that had once been food. The smell was old sweat and something medicinal, like the inside of a first aid kit left too long in a hot car. Officer Renata Diaz, the one who seemed to be running things, crouched by the cot and didn't touch it. Somebody was living down here, she said. Recently. Days, not weeks. I said the only thing I could think to say, which was nothing at all for a good 10 seconds, and then, I don't understand. We don't have anybody staying with us. She looked up at me the way you look at a man you're not sure is lying to you or just hasn't caught up to his own house yet. Mr. Combs, do you have a permit on file for a room addition or a basement conversion? Because according to the county, this space doesn't exist. They found the storage unit 2 days later. I don't know exactly when I stopped being the confused homeowner and started being the man detectives wanted to sit down with, but it happened the way these things happen, quietly, over a kitchen table, with a legal pad and a cup of coffee going cold. A detective named Sam Okafor asked me if I'd ever rented a unit at a place called Schuylkill Self-Storage off Route 61. I told him no, absolutely not. I'd never even driven past the place that I knew of. He turned his legal pad around, so I could see the printout underneath it. My name, my signature, or something close enough to it that I had to look twice. Paid in cash. 6 months running. When they opened the unit that afternoon with me standing there in the cold, they found a rolled sleeping bag, a duffel of men's clothing in a size that wasn't mine, prescription bottles with somebody else's name scratched off the label, and a manila envelope with 3 photographs of a man I had never seen in my life. Younger than me, maybe 50, tired eyes, the kind of face you'd walk past in a grocery store without a second look. Mr. Combs, Detective Okafor said, watching me the way Diaz had. This man's name is Raymond Tully. His family filed a missing person report on him 11 days ago. You know him? No, I said, and it was true, completely true, the truest thing I said all week. I have never laid eyes on that man. But here's the part I didn't tell Okafor that afternoon, because I needed to be alone with it first. Needed to turn it over in private before I handed it to anybody wearing a badge. When I finally got back to the house that night, I walked straight up to our bedroom, to Peg's side of the closet, to the shoebox on the top shelf where she keeps old photographs she never got around to putting in albums. I don't know what made me go there. Some instinct older than thinking. I went through them one by one, and there he was. Raymond Tully, the same tired eyes, tucked into an envelope behind a stack of photos from our trip to the Poconos in 2003, half smiling at whoever was holding the camera. I sat down on the edge of the bed we'd shared for 39 years, in a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to somebody else, holding a photograph of a missing man that my wife had kept hidden 2 feet above where I hang my coats every single night. And I thought about all 42 years. Every anniversary, every Sunday drive, every night she sat in that armchair with her tea and her crossword, completely calm, completely unbothered, while this man's face sat 18 inches from my side of the bed. How long had she known him? How long had this been sitting there, waiting? At 64, I figured the worst thing that could still happen to a man my age was his knees going, or his heart, or his memory. Turns out the worst thing is finding out the woman who slept beside you for 4 decades was never fully in the room with you at all. If you've stuck with me this far and you want more stories like this one, hit that like button and consider subscribing. It really does help more than you'd think. Thank you, truly. Here's something nobody warns you about when you find out your own wife has been lying to you for years. It isn't the lie itself that gets you. It's realizing she was never confused, never overwhelmed, never just going through something private she'd tell you about eventually. She was working the whole time, and you were the job. I need you to understand where my head was at this point. It had been 5 days since Curtis Boyle texted me from my own basement. 5 days since 3 officers pulled a locked door off a room that shouldn't have existed. 5 days since Detective Okafor started finding reasons to stop by. Sometimes with questions, sometimes just to sit in his sedan at the end of my driveway like I wouldn't notice a man idling there for 40 minutes. I noticed him. I'm old, not stupid. Peg came home from Harrisburg a day early. When she walked through that door, she looked exactly the way a shocked, worried wife of 39 years is supposed to look. Wide eyes, both hands pressed to her mouth, then to my face. Walter, my God, are you all right? Doreen called me. I came straight back. And God help me. For the better part of an hour, I believed every word of it. She cried in the kitchen while I walked her through the bar lock, the cot, the smell. She held onto my sleeve the whole time. This is insane, she kept saying. Somebody did this to us. Somebody's trying to ruin you. It was that word, us, that I turned over later that night lying awake next to her, listening to her breathe like she always breathed, slow and even, like a woman with nothing on her conscience. Us, not you. She'd folded herself into the crime before anybody had even accused her of anything. The storage unit is what cracked the performance, but only for a heartbeat. When Okafor came back 4 days later and laid out what they'd found at Schuylkill self-storage, I watched my wife's face, the way you'd watch a pot you're not sure is about to boil over. It lasted less than a second. A flicker, like a light bulb deciding whether to give out. Then the tears came right back on schedule. Someone is framing my husband, she said, gripping my hand across the table hard enough to hurt. Walter has never rented a storage unit in his life. He can barely work the television remote. Okafor looked at her, then at me, then back at her, slow. Mrs. Combs, how can you be so certain so fast? And she didn't even pause. Because I know my husband. Not he'd never do this. Not that's impossible. She knew me. She kept it about certainty, not character. That's a lawyer's sentence wearing a wife's voice, and it took me 2 more days to understand why that distinction had been sitting so wrong in my stomach. I have a friend, Hollis Faraday, known him since Vietnam, which means he's earned the right to tell me hard truths without flinching first. Hollis spent 30 years as a claims investigator before he retired, which means he's spent 30 years learning how ordinary-looking people build lies that pass every inspection. I called him on day 6 and told him everything, start to finish. He didn't say a word for almost a full minute. Then, Walter, how many accounts do you and Peg share? 4, I told him, checking, the joint savings, a money market she'd opened years back, and the account we use for the grandkids' birthdays. Who handles them? I opened my mouth and realized I didn't actually know the honest answer. Peg did. Had for going on 15 years, ever since I told her once, offhand, that I found the online banking confusing and would rather not deal with it. Everything always seemed fine. Bills paid, savings intact. Why would I ever look closer? Pull every statement you can get your hands on, Hollis said. Go back 10 years if the bank will give it to you. I pulled 8. What I found didn't announce itself. That was the whole design of it. No big withdrawals, no wire transfers to some country I'd never heard of, nothing a person would notice glancing at a monthly summary. Just small, patient movements, year after year. $60 here to an account under a name I didn't recognize. A subscription charge to a business that turned out, when I looked it up, not to exist at all. A cash withdrawal every couple months, never large enough to trip anything at the bank. Over 8 years, it came to just under $41,000, moved so carefully I never heard so much as a whisper. I sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with those statements spread out under the overhead light and felt something settle into my chest that wasn't panic. It was colder than panic, because this wasn't a woman who'd made one bad decision during a hard year. The first strange transaction was dated 11 months after our youngest was born. She had started this while I was still up at 3 a.m., warming bottles, still building a crib on a Sunday afternoon with her handing me the instructions page by page. Hollis came by the next morning, and we laid it all out across my workbench in the garage. Bank records, the storage unit paperwork, the police report, a timeline I'd started keeping on the back of an old wiring diagram because it was the only paper within reach at 3 a.m. He studied it a long while without saying anything, which with Hollis means what he's looking at is worse than either of us wanted to say out loud. The storage rental, he finally said. Where was your phone the night before that agreement got signed? I thought about it. On the charger, on my nightstand, same as every night of my adult life. And your wife? In our bed, obviously. Same room, same bed, 42 years. I had never once thought of a phone charging 6 inches from my head as a way in. She'd lifted it while I slept, driven out to Route 61, Sign my name the way you'd hum a tune you've heard 10,000 times, paid cash, and been back under the covers before my alarm went off at 6. The plumber, Hollis said. Did you call from your cell, or is there still a house line? No house line. Hasn't been one in 15 years. Pull your outgoing calls for that morning. I already knew, somewhere underneath the part of me still trying not to know, what I'd find. The call to Boyle Brothers had gone out from my number at 9:14 that morning. I'd been at the hardware store by 8:30, had the receipt with the timestamp to prove it, buying a new washer for a leaking spigot like a man with nothing at all on his mind. Peg had made the call. From my phone, taken and returned without me ever noticing a gap, to bring a young plumber down into that basement, straight to that door, straight to a smell she knew would put a cop in my house within the hour. She had built the entire first act herself. However that noise got into the water heater, Hollis figures some kind of small device wired into the line, something you could remove in under a minute if you knew what you were doing and where to look. The hidden room, framed in at some point I still can't account for. The cot, the dish, the smell she'd manufactured somehow, all of it staged to go off exactly when a stranger with no reason to lie would be the one to find it. Walter, Hollis said, and his voice dropped into the register men use right before they say something they'd rather not have to. This isn't something a person plans in a few weeks. Money moving for 8 years means she's been building this since before your youngest could walk. That's not a decision. That's a career. I stood up and walked to the garage door and looked out at the driveway I'd resealed every 3 summers like clockwork, the maple tree Peg had planted the year we moved in that was now taller than the house. I had spent 4 decades keeping this property in order while she quietly dug a hole under all of it. At 64, I had one move left in me, and I hadn't told Hollis yet because it only worked if Peg stayed completely convinced she'd already won. I did not call a lawyer. I did not confront her at that kitchen table. I did not walk back to Detective Okafor with what Hollis and I had put together, because evidence from a man the police already have their eye on doesn't land the same way. It gets filed under desperate. And Peg had accounted for that too. Of course she had, so I did the one thing her whole plan hadn't left room for. I stopped being a man she could read. First, I called my brother Otis, retired Navy, lives out past Lebanon on 11 acres with 2 hunting dogs and a workshop full of tools he still knows how to use. Otis doesn't panic, doesn't raise his voice, doesn't do much of anything before he's thought it through twice. I drove out there on a Thursday, told Peg I needed some air, and watched her face rearrange itself into perfect, patient understanding. "Take whatever time you need, sweetheart," she said, and I nearly smiled at how well she still did it. At his kitchen table, over coffee and cornbread his late wife used to make, I laid it all out for Otis the way I had for Hollis. He didn't interrupt once, which for him is the same as another man weeping. When I finished, he sat with it a long moment. "You said she still talks to that friend of hers," he said. "Every week, sometimes more." I told him, Carol Ann Weller. Known each other since before Peg and I ever met. Lives over in Lancaster now, visits a few times a year, and they do these long calls, hour, 2 hours. Peg always takes them out on the back porch with the sliding door shut. Otis nodded slow. "How long you had a way of hearing that porch?" I looked at him. "Otis, I don't." "I know," he said, "but you're about to. I want to be clear about something. I am not by nature a vengeful man. I ran the youth wrestling program at the rec center for 9 years. I've never once raised a hand to anybody outside of a gym in my whole life. I'm the man at the block party who makes sure the grill's not running out of propane and nobody's left out of the horseshoe game. But I am a patient man, more patient than most people give a man my age credit for being, and patience turned out to be the only thing worth having in a fight like this one." Otis ordered a small recorder online, paid cash through a prepaid card, had it sent to a friend's address 2 towns over, the kind of quiet, operational care that 30 years in the Navy just leaves permanently wired into a man. I drove home Saturday, let Peg hug me in the doorway, felt her heartbeat against my chest, and felt, strangely, nothing at all. That absence of feeling was the strangest part, not the anger, the total quiet where the anger should have been. I set the little recorder behind a stack of gardening magazines on the porch windowsill on a Sunday while Peg was at the grocery store, a spot neither of us had touched in years. Took me under 3 minutes. Drove out to Otis's that evening, checked that the audio was picking up clean, drove home for dinner. Peg had made pot roast. Asked if I was feeling more like myself. Getting there, I told her. She smiled and topped off my glass. I waited 16 days. 16 days of being Walter Combs, devoted husband, cooperative person of interest, patient answerer of Detective Okafor's questions, quiet witness to Peg holding my hand in front of him, and performing worry so completely that even I had moments, real disorienting moments, of wondering if grief had made me imagine the whole thing. Then, on a Tuesday evening, Carol Ann Weller came up from Lancaster. I told Peg I was heading over to Hollis's for the evening, kissed her cheek, drove 3 blocks, parked, and opened the recording app on my phone. The audio came through clear as anything. They talked 20 minutes about nothing, a grandson's soccer schedule, a diner off Route 30 worth the drive. I nearly convinced myself I'd wasted Otis's money and my own good sense on an old man's paranoia. Then Peg's voice changed key. Quiet, the same way a radio station drifts, same voice, different everything underneath it. He still hasn't put it together, Peg said. Carol Ann was quiet a second. You're sure? That detective's practically living in your driveway. Walter's Walter, Peg said. He fixes what's in front of him. He always has. He's never once looked for what isn't. And Raymond? Comfortable, Peg said. He agreed to stay out of sight for 90 days. I'm paying him well enough that he'll keep his mouth shut and enjoy the beach while he's at it. By the time those 90 days are up, Walter won't be able to dig himself out from under it. A pause. Peg. Carol Ann's voice went careful. What actually happens to him? He becomes the answer the police already want, Peg said. Simple as reading off a grocery list. They've got his name, his signature, his money trail. I just have to let it keep building on its own. Another month, it won't need my help anymore. And you'll be where? Somewhere with a beach of my own, Peg said, and then she laughed, easy and warm, the laugh of a woman watching something go exactly according to plan. I sat in that car 3 blocks from the house I'd lived in for 33 years, listening to my wife laugh about the architecture of my ruin, and that quiet came down over me again, cold and complete. I didn't call Otis. I didn't call Hollis. I didn't call Okafor. Not yet. I need to tell you about Raymond Tully, because he matters more than a name on a missing person report. 2 days after Carol Ann's visit, I hired a retired state trooper named Dale Pruitt, a friend of Hollis's, the kind of man whose whole personality is a case file. I gave him one job: find Raymond Tully. It took him 5 days. Raymond was exactly where Peg had said, a motel outside Myrtle Beach, paying cash, registered under a name that wasn't quite his own. Dale got photographs, got him on record, got a signed statement out of a man who, it turned out, hadn't fully understood what he'd agreed to and was considerably less relaxed about the arrangement. Once, a retired trooper sat down across from him and explained the word conspiracy in plain language. Raymond wasn't a criminal, not really. He was a man behind on his bills who made one very bad decision. He gave Dale everything: how Peg had found him through an old coworker, what she'd paid him, how he'd been coached to vanish for 90 days and let the story do the rest. He cried while he signed it, and Dale sat with him until he stopped, because Dale turns out to be a decent man underneath the case file exterior. I now had a recorded conversation from my own back porch and a signed statement from a missing man who'd never actually been missing. 2 things Peg had no idea existed. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't drive straight to the Reading Police Department and hand it over, because evidence coming from a man the department already suspects becomes something else, something slow and public, and Peg would lawyer up and go quiet and spend the next 18 months taking apart everything Dale and Hollis and I had built, piece by piece. She was good at taking things apart. I'd learned that the hard way, so I did something simpler. On a Friday evening, while Peg sat in the living room with Rebecca and her tea, I went out to the garage, sat at my workbench with my old laptop, and sent 2 files from an email address she'd never seen to a phone number she wouldn't recognize. The recording. A photograph of Raymond Tully, alive and tan, holding a folded newspaper with that morning's date. No message. No name. I closed the laptop, went inside, and went to bed early. She came upstairs 40 minutes later. I watched through half-closed eyes as she stood in the bedroom doorway, a long moment, phone still in her hand, completely motionless. In 42 years, I had never once seen Margaret Combs stand still like that. She was always moving, always managing something. She stood in that doorway like a woman who'd just heard a sound she couldn't place and couldn't shake. Good. The next morning I drove to the station and set a Navy folder on Detective Okafor's desk, Dale's full report, the statement, the photographs, the bank records, the call logs, all of it laid out in order, because I've always been a man who reads the instructions before he starts. Okafor went through it without looking up for nearly 15 minutes. "Mr. Combs," he finally said. "Sam," I said, "I think we both know I never rented that storage unit." He looked at me a long moment, then reached for his phone. Peg was arrested on a Thursday. 17 charges, including conspiracy and obstruction. They walked her out of our house in handcuffs at 8:30 on a morning cold enough to fog your breath. I stood in the doorway and watched. She looked back at me once, just once, before they helped her into the car, and for the first time in 42 years I couldn't find anything behind her eyes I recognized. I just nodded, because here's what she never understood about me, the one flaw sitting right at the center of her whole careful plan. She'd spent years studying what I did, where I went, how I signed my name, how I slept. She never once bothered to notice what I was thinking. At 64, I'm not a man who makes speeches or slams doors on his way out of a room. I don't need the last word. I only ever needed the last move. She spent years building a cage for me, one quiet transfer at a time. I built her one in 16 days. Somewhere out there tonight, Margaret Combs is lying awake looking over her shoulder for a husband she was certain she'd already accounted for, a man she was sure she knew down to the bone. She knew my signature better than I did most days. She never once knew my spine, and in the end, that was always going to be the only mistake that mattered. If this one got you, do an old man a favor and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and tell me down in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It matters more than you'd think. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you next time.